The following is a message from Christ Central Manchester, a church that meets in the heart of Manchester in the UK. To find out more about us, please visit www.christcentral.org.uk.
Good morning. Again, my name's Keith. I'm one of the leaders here, or pastors here at Christ Central. If you're a guest with us, then I just extend the warm welcome that Tina's already given. Just to say it's great to have you with us and hope you've enjoyed it so far. This morning we're going to be carrying on in this series in the book of Philippians that we started a couple of weeks ago. We're in Philippians chapter 1 still. We haven't got very far. Chapter 1 and verse 12. So we'll read that in a moment. But just to say, this is a letter to the church in Philippi. If you've missed the first couple of weeks, you can get them online. But just to very quickly summarise what we've got to so far. This is a letter to a bunch of Christians just like you and me, in a different time, a different context, but with similar struggles. They may not have the technology that we have, but they'll have similar struggles in principle, similar fears, similar battles, and the same solutions are found in the resources of God for them and for us. Nothing's new under the sun in most ways. The Apostle Paul, who's writing to them from prison, probably in Rome. Best guess really is that he's in Rome and he's in prison. At least he's probably under house arrest, but he's probably still chained up, as we'll get to later, physically chained up. And he's told them already from prison of his love for them, of this kind of deep gut, heartfelt affection that he has for them, that he prays for them. We looked at that. We looked at what he actually prayed when he prays for them, that they might grow in love for God, kind of assisted by knowledge of God, that they grow in love and knowledge of God. And then we read this morning from verse 12, and it should appear on the screen for you if you don't have a Bible. Verse 12, he says this: "Now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me, that is to go into prison, what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. As a result, it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard and to everyone else that I am in chains for Christ. And because of my chains, most of the brothers and sisters that have become confident in the Lord and dare all the more to proclaim the gospel without fear. It is true that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others out of goodwill. The latter do so out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defence of the gospel. The former preach Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing that they can stir up trouble for me while I am in chains. But what does it matter? The important thing that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached. And because of this, I rejoice. Yes, and I will continue to rejoice, for I know that through the prayers and God's provision of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, what has happened to me will turn out for my deliverance. I eagerly expect and hope that I will in no way be ashamed, but will have sufficient courage, so that now, as always, Christ will be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death. For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. If I am to go on living in the body, this will mean fruitful labour for me. Yet what shall I choose? I do not know. I am torn between the two. I desire to depart and be with Christ, which is better by far, but it is more necessary for you that I remain in the body. Convinced of this, I know that I will remain, and I will continue with all of you for your progress and joy in the faith, so that through my being with you, again your boasting in Christ Jesus will abound on account of me. Whatever happens, conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. Then, whether I come and see you or only hear about you in my absence, I will know that you stand firm in the one Spirit, striving together as one for the faith of the gospel, without being frightened in any way by those who oppose you. This is a sign to them that they will be destroyed, but that you will be saved, and that by God. For it has been granted to you on behalf of Christ not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for him, since you are going through the same struggle you saw I had, and now hear that I still have." Two things we're going to look at this morning, and they are both obsessions of Paul's. One's an obsession with the message about Jesus, what we call the gospel, When I say the word gospel, I mean all that's true, all that's true of the good, amazing story of all that Jesus has done for you and me. That's what we mean by the gospel, in very, very quick summary. It's the fact that he died for you and me, that he went to the cross for you and me and died, that he rose again, that he ascended to heaven to take away all the junk in the world, all the junk that we do to each other. That's the gospel. So whenever I say that, it's a short word for a lot of things. It's the good stuff about Jesus. And Paul's obsessed with this story of Jesus, this gospel. That's the first thing he's obsessed with in this passage and just generally. The second thing he's obsessed with is Jesus himself, the one who the story is all about. He's not just obsessed with the story, he's obsessed with the person in the story, the hero of the story. So we're going to look at these two things this morning. Gospel obsession and Christ-centered living and dying. Because for Paul, as we'll see, to live for Christ means everything's for Christ. Even dying is for Jesus. So our title this morning is All for Jesus. All for Jesus. And I make no apologies, this is going to be a bit of a one-track sermon this morning. Kind of see where it's going already. Just hope it hits you with a bit of a newness. So Paul's obsession, well, the first thing to note is him talking about the gospel going out, the gospel being told more and more boldly, being shared more and more, and he's loving that fact. He's loving it to the point where he doesn't really talk about how much suffering he's going through. Did you notice that? The whole emphasis is not about how difficult his life is. It's all about the amazing fact that the gospel is being told more and more. The gospel is being heralded more and more. He could complain about the suffering he's going through, but he doesn't. Paul kind of says to the guys in Philippi, the church there, he says, look, see past the chains. I've got chains. Doesn't even mention the fact that they're biting into his wrists and causing him pain, which is what they would have been doing eventually. He says, actually, look past the chains. Look past the chains and see all that God's doing. It's like, see through the chink, the links in the chain, and see the sunlight coming through it, and look at that stuff, all the incredible stuff God is doing. He's saying, see past all that and see what God's doing. And he's setting them a wonderful example. He says, see the wonder that the message of Jesus is being proclaimed. Heralded is the kind of idea that, like a herald in the old days would come into town with news from on high that the king wants to get out to the whole land, that there's this, it's basically coming into town, coming into a village to share the news of someone superior to you. That's what's going on here. Paul says people are heralding the gospel, the wonder of Jesus is being boasted about and preached about and heralded all over the place. And rather than people shrinking back in fear, because I might end up in prison, rather than worrying about being in prison themselves, they're going for it more and more fearlessly. He's saying, this is great. Don't worry about me. Don't worry about you ended up in prison. Look what's happening through me being in prison. See through it and see all that's going on. He's obsessed. This guy is obsessed. Kind of almost, you could say slightly, maybe a little bit too obsessed. No, not at all. Just captivated. Obsessed in a good way. He says, I'm glad that, in one way, I'm glad I'm in chains, because you know what? I mean, probably he's in Rome, as we've said. Probably he's under house arrest, as we've said. He might end up appearing before Caesar. Therefore, it's quite likely, we don't quite know, but it's quite likely that he's got the elite Praetorian Roman guards looking after him. They're like the elite. They're like the ones with double pay, double honour. To be this group of soldiers was an honour. And he's got them doing shifts, being chained to him. And you think he kept quiet about Jesus and the reason he was there? Of course not. The whole lot, all of them that have taken a shift with him have heard about why he's there. He's in chains for one reason and one reason alone, Jesus. He's in chains for one person and one person alone, Jesus. And he's letting them all know. And he says it's brilliant. And in one sense, he's saying, look, if I wasn't in chains, none of these guys would have heard about it. Or maybe they wouldn't have heard about it. And yet they all are, the whole lot. These are proper, hardened soldiers. And he's just gossiping the gospel to all of them. Happy as Larry with his chains on, telling them all about Jesus. Whoever Larry is. Watchman Nee, a Christian man, obsessed with Jesus and the gospel, was arrested for being a Christian preacher in 1952 in China. He died in prison 20 years later in 1972. Only his wife was allowed to visit him, apparently, during those 20 years in prison. His wife died 6 months before him, and their ashes were eventually buried together. This is the account of, and you can get lots of books written by Watchman Nee. Somehow he managed to get his writings out, and I'd recommend them. This is the account of his grandniece, who went with his sister-in-law, so one of his wife's sisters. They went together to retrieve Watchman Nee's ashes. And she said this: "In June 1972, we got notice from the labour farm that my granduncle had passed away. My eldest grandaunt and I rushed to the labour farm. When we got there, we learned that he had already been cremated. We could only see his ashes. Before his departure, he left a piece of paper under his pillow, which had several lines of big words written in a shaking hand. He wanted to testify to the truth which he had even until his death with his lifelong experience. That truth is, quote, Christ is the Son of God who died for the redemption of sinners and resurrected after 3 days. This is the greatest truth in the universe," he goes on to say. "I die because of my belief in Christ." Watchman Nee. When the officer of the labour farm showed us this paper, I prayed that the Lord would let me quickly remember it by heart, because presumably it was going to be ripped up and thrown away. My granduncle had passed away. He was faithful until death. With a crown stained with blood, he went to be with the Lord. Although God did not fulfill his last wish to come out alive to join his wife, the Lord prepared something even better. They were reunited before the Lord. Paul's account here in Philippians is 2,000 years old. It's 2,000 years old, and it's in a different place and time, and it's in black and white on a page, and it can seem out of date, or it can seem irrelevant. In the last 50 years and still today, people are obsessed with Jesus and are doing what Paul did and speaking about it as Paul did. It's not an old, out-of-date way of being. People are still like this. People are still doing this. In the last 50 years and still today, people will suffer, be in chains, and possibly even die with the same incredible joy as we talked about earlier, the same incredible obsession in them. It is not going out of fashion. Something is going on there, right? It's too easy for us, arguably, in our comfortable society, in our comfortable country, in comparison. It's easy for us to potentially drift. We haven't got to make the kind of choices that people like Paul and Watchman Nee had to make. They didn't have to choose. We don't have to choose between Jesus and the potential for prison, or worse, or denouncing Jesus. We haven't got to make that choice. We don't have to, you see what I'm saying? In a sense, it's easier for them. You know what I mean and what I don't mean. In a sense, the decision is easier. Am I going to follow Jesus and risk suffering for him? Or am I not going to follow Jesus? We can follow Jesus without much danger of suffering like that for him. And then we can become comfortable. Then we can become aware of all the things that shine around us. And they can be good things. We can become more and more infatuated with things that aren't Jesus and begin to drift into a comfortable, lukewarm walk with Jesus. We can become delighted with iPhones and sport and relationships and friendships, or we can become so busy that Jesus begins to not really get a look in anymore. I'm not trying to bring condemnation. I'm just saying this is our situation that we find ourselves in. We haven't got to make this black and white choice between following Jesus and all that might go with it negatively. or not following him. We can follow him and then become, wow, the new iPhone. Or this relationship, or this friendship, or work so busy. When we're obsessed with Jesus and the gospel, as we see with Paul, we see past the suffering. Somehow he sees past the chains rubbing into his wrists and being rubbed raw. You see past any complaints that you might have to God about him abandoning you. We don't hear any of this from Paul. We see past the complaints that we might have about all that we've done for him, and yet we've ended up in prison. And we see the gospel going forward when we end up in this place like Paul. Now, I'm not saying Paul was perfect. He wasn't Jesus. Jesus was perfect, but Paul wasn't. And I bet you Paul had to work through some of this stuff, if not at this point, but maybe earlier on in his life. He had to work through. God, I've done all this for you and I've ended up shipwrecked? Are you kidding me? He may have had to work that kind of stuff through. He may have even had to work that one through as he sat in the prison in Rome. We don't know. He's got to a good place, though, where he can say to these guys, look, see past it. Doesn't even mention the fact that he hasn't eaten a decent meal in weeks or months. He doesn't even mention any of that kind of stuff. He doesn't even, as we'll get onto in a moment, moan about the people that are preaching out of bad motivation that we've read. People are somehow trying to make your situation worse. Christians. Not people who don't know Jesus. People that know Jesus are trying to make his situation worse. And yet he doesn't even, if it was me, that would be the whole letter. Can you believe X, Y, and Z and what they're doing? If I'm honest, that would be a big theme. And how much my wrists hurt. And the rubbish food. And the fact I haven't showered for weeks. Some of you youngsters might think that's quite attractive. Sorry, I'm just thinking back to New Day and the competitions they have to see who can go the longest without having a shower. That would be the themes. I don't know what your themes would be. What do you think you'd say in a letter reporting from prison? Do you think you'd talk about how brilliant it is that people are preaching the gospel even if they're doing it to hurt you? Maybe you would. You see the gospel going forward if you're Paul. You see past these badly motivated people who want to make life harder for you. I don't understand how he does this, but he does it. And he does two things when he does this. His obsession with the gospel, with the good news about Jesus, shines through, and he's doing two things. He's saying, first of all, he's giving an example to these Philippians who, as we will see later on, they've got some disunity going on. There's a couple of women that go down in history for having quite a public argument. We'll see that later on, and Paul has to tell them all to sort of get around them and tell them to work it out. It's amazing that they went down in history for that. Kind of poor them. But he knows there's stuff going on. There's some disunity in the church. People are falling out with each other, and he's trying to give them an example of a charitable attitude, I read in one commentary. He's given an example of what it is to see past people's bad motivations and see what God's doing through them anyway. I mean, what? So he's doing that, first of all. He's giving them an example of how to handle the disunity that they've got. And secondly, he's highlighting something that still happens today. These people, as I've probably alluded to already, are not preaching. Some commentators think that these guys that are preaching with a bad motive are preaching a false gospel, that they're what's known as Judaizers. They're people that are just trying to tag Jesus on to the Jewish law, and they're preaching a false gospel. It's not that for me. Because if it was, he wouldn't even entertain that they were doing anything decent. He would say their whole effort is doomed. And he would, at times he says some horrendous things about those kinds of people. He tells them off. The circumcision brigade, he tells them he wishes that they go the whole hog. He says later on, and cut themselves right off, as it were. He says it, I'm not making it up, it's in the Bible. But what he's actually... Now, what he's saying is there are these people, and they are not preaching a false gospel. Otherwise, he'd be much more negative about their behaviour. Now, we don't quite know what they're doing. Either they're in fear of their own lives and therefore they're trying to distance themselves from him. Maybe they're looking down upon him because he's been put in prison and they don't want to be associated with him. Whatever's going on, they're deliberately talking badly of him. Even as they preach the wonderful message about Jesus, they're trying to distance themselves from Paul. It's shocking. We need to hear it. It's terrible. This is a Christian pastor. Imagine it today. One of the other church leaders in Manchester has been put in prison, and I get up here and I preach the gospel, I preach the good news about Jesus, but I kind of throw in a little caveat at the end of the sermon, but have you heard about Dewberry down the road? He's in prison. We don't want anything to do with him. No, he's only there because he's preaching the gospel. That's how terrible it would be. And I'd expect you all to leave the church. And you would. I know you would. It would be terrible. We can't quite work out exactly what's going on, but it's something like that. They don't want to be identified with Paul. And Paul's example in this is unbelievable almost. He says, don't be distracted, don't be downhearted or put off, even by Christians who don't like you. This is massive, because the amount of people who go down the tubes because another Christian doesn't like them. Oh, I'd love God more, but they are so horrible to me. Paul's given us a wonderful example. He says it's the gospel that counts. I'm not sure we always think like this, and this is why I'm not just preaching to you, I'm preaching to myself. He says it's the gospel that counts. It's the fact that it's going out there that matters. And almost, Christians aren't perfect. I don't know why we expect Christians to be perfect when we're not. It's amazing. Paul's saying, surprise, surprise, there's some Christians that are saying some horrible things. But get over it. I'm getting over it. The gospel's going forward. I was going to say, get in. Brilliant. In case you don't know what I mean by get in. He's saying, yes, the gospel's going forward. It doesn't matter what Mavis says about me, or what Luke, whoever he is preaching about me. It doesn't matter. The gospel's going forward. That's what counts. Is this how we think in your job? On a Monday morning, whatever you do, maybe you're not in work at the moment, whatever you're doing, wherever you are, Monday to Friday, Monday to Sunday, if it's shift work, whatever it is you do, is this how you are? Is this how you think? Are you more concerned with the gospel than you used to be? Or has that dwindled and gone the other way? Are you not only wanting to do a good job and influence those around you for Jesus, which is all great, but are you also wanting to see the good news of Jesus breaking out? Have we drifted into some sort of, I just want to influence for good? Are you still obsessed with the gospel? Am I? As Paul is. Second thing, he's not only obsessed with the gospel about Jesus, he's obsessed with Jesus. And we must not divorce the two. You see, we don't ever see that in Paul, and it can happen. We can get so focused on the correct message of the gospel. You know, we hear a lot today in certain parts of the church, gospel this and gospel that, which is brilliant, as long as it's not to the detriment of a relationship and a friendship with the person of Jesus through his Holy Spirit. So we could get obsessed with correct musicianship and wonderful times of worship. We could get obsessed with a correct teaching of the Bible, which we want. We want all of that. We could become obsessed with a particular theological point or doctrinal statement or one little bit of what the Bible talks about. We could get obsessed with certain things and we could even get obsessed with the good news about Jesus and lose sight of who the story is all about in the first place. Paul's obsession with the gospel is not the end, it's a means to the end, and the end is an obsession with Jesus. Being gospel-centered, which I think is important, must only be on the way to being Jesus-centered. Does that make sense? So this circle, Jesus has got to be the middle. Even if the next ring out is something to do with how wonderful the gospel is. Otherwise it's like saying, you know, I love the story about my wife. It's a wonderful story. You know, I love to get it correct. You know, I love to make sure I get the dates and times right about when she was born and the story of her growing up and the school she went to and her academic achievements and her sporting prowess, which is a short history. She's not here. She'd laugh if she was here, I think. But, you know, I'm passionate about getting the story correct. We haven't spoken for 3 years, and I barely know her anymore. But I'm passionate about the story, the message about my wife. We've got to be careful. Can't just get the story right. We've got to know that Jesus at the beginning and the end and the middle of the story. Know him. Daily, knowing him more. We looked at this last time, a couple of weeks ago. Growing in love of God. And again, it's not all dependent on you. I hope none of this morning comes through as I must do more, I must work harder, I must be more obsessed with Jesus and his gospel. No, it all starts with all that he's done for you. It's daily drinking deep of all that he has done and all that he is, that we then live and are obsessed more and more with the message about him, but predominantly him. We love the gospel, but we worship Jesus, and we love Jesus. We don't worship the gospel. We worship Jesus, who the gospel is about, and we love him. We live with the Holy Spirit. We don't live with teaching about the Holy Spirit. That would be rubbish. We want to be informed by teaching about the Holy Spirit, but we want to live in friendship with this wonderful counselor, this wonderful paraclete, which is the Greek, which means the one that comes alongside and comforts and encourages, puts courage in us. Like a running coach, if you're into running, running alongside you and saying, go on, keep going. We want to know that. We don't want to just know about it. We want to know it. We want to know him. Then, from a life lived solely focused on Jesus, from living for Jesus, for Paul, dying for Jesus is like a logical conclusion. If I'm going to live all out for Jesus, well then I can die for him. This is where we get onto some ground I am with you on if you're saying this is unknown territory. I have never had to face down the barrel of a shotgun, as it were, in the way that Paul is here. Maybe some of you have. But I think until you have, you don't quite know what it is in the same way that Paul does to be able to write this and really mean it. And I think that's okay. I think it's okay to live thinking, I would love to have that attitude towards death when I get there. I don't know that I have it now because I'm not in that situation. I think that's But for Paul, he's so obsessed with living for Jesus that dying for Jesus is like, when he's faced with it, there's a real potential, real possibility in prison there in Rome. He can see it. It's like death's knocking at the door. He says, if I die, in the end, better. I mean, what I think is true though is if we don't live obsessed with Jesus, if we live increasingly obsessed with other things, then it won't be very easy to die for Jesus because we wouldn't have been used to living for him. Does that make sense? Paul is sure, he says, that he will not be ashamed. He says, I have a hope. And when he says hope, it's not like I hope I'll get a Ferrari next week. It's a kind of long-distance hope that is nearly certain I'm going to get there. He says, I'm confident, I have this sure hope that I'm not going to be ashamed. He just doesn't know which way it's going to go. He says, I'm not going to be ashamed before God, even if whichever way it goes. It might go live or die, I don't know. It might be that I live, it might be that I die, it might be that I get out of prison alive, it might be that I get out of prison and go and be with the Lord. But I'll get out and I'm not going to be ashamed either way. He's confident he's not going to be ashamed. He's kind of got it in his gut. He's going to stand for Jesus. He's kind of in a place that maybe we aren't in yet, even with that. And then he says, but I'm not quite sure. I'm sure about that, but I'm not quite sure which way it's going to go. I love that. In a sense, I love that. He's not saying, oh, I know I'm going to be delivered. Or I know I'm going to die even. And then he says this incredible line. I can't, or a couple of lines, I can't choose. I can't choose. And actually, if you push me, I'd rather be with Jesus because that's gain. My whole life is about Jesus and going and being with him. Well, that's getting him full on. That's gain. That's a win. We don't get it, do we? We don't quite, if we're honest, we don't quite get it. Or it's just me. If we're honest, when we face that phrase, that statement, we don't quite get it. To live is die, to Christ is, to die is gain. We don't quite, just me, somebody nod. Yeah, we don't quite get, or whatever. No, we don't quite get it, Keith. A friend of ours, pastor in South Africa, I remember him speaking about the fact that when he had cancer, he's been clear now for a few years, but when he had it, and it was serious, and what I mean was, on a number of occasions, he as he says, he looked down the barrel of the shotgun. And he said, when I came face to face with it, when I was looking down the barrel of the shotgun, he said, I honestly got to the point where it was a 2-horse race, and going and being with Jesus was the winner. That's what I mean. I don't think you can say it until you've really faced it. His wife then got up and said, it wasn't a 2-horse race for her. There was no way she wanted him to go. And that is the other side of this. It is not all glory, glory, die and go and be with Jesus. We're not some sort of suicide mob. This is real. And when people die, the people are left behind are the ones with tears in their eyes, streaming down their faces. It's all great for the one that dies, really. This is what Paul's saying. The rest of us, rightly, it's horrendous. It's loss. So it's not like Paul's out of touch with that. We read in Acts where he doesn't even die, just leaves them. They know it's going to be a long-term departure. When he leaves the Ephesian elders, they're in tears. It's not heartless. This is not rah-rah, doesn't matter about emotion or feeling or real life. This is real life. I remember hearing another American pastor talking about he had a tumour on his brain. He suddenly found out one day because he just passed out. And they realised he had this massive tumour on his brain. And again, I think he's clear at the moment. But I remember him saying that again, when he faced all of that, he said this incredible line. I can't quite find it quite word for word, but it was along the lines of, I remember him saying it, just not word for word. He said, if I die, I know that Jesus will be a better husband and father than I am. How can you say that? I appreciated it. I was touched by it. I didn't get it. Honestly didn't get it. But he meant it. Paul, Watchman Nee, these other people and others you may have heard about, they display an obsession with Jesus and his gospel that carries them past the concerns about suffering, past the concerns about the bad behaviour of other Christians even. They just love to see the gospel spreading. Paul's view of suffering in prison is it's just a different call on his life now. He used to preach the gospel in the open air. He used to preach the gospel in synagogues. Now he's just preaching it in a prison, house arrest, in chains. He sees that role as just as valid, which says to you and me, whether you're the chief executive or the toilet cleaner, your role in life that God has got for you at this moment is valid. You can live for him wherever you're at. That's what it says to me. Then Paul goes on to say, not only does he see no difference in these roles, not only can he see past suffering, not only can he see past the bad behaviour of others to see the obsession he's got with the gospel lived out, Paul then sees death as a more viable option. He prefers it because he'll gain Jesus. And other people, as we've mentioned, have found a similar place when they've been faced with the possibility of death. Living and serving the church in Philippi, suffering in prison, dying in prison, all of it for Paul would be all for Jesus. He would see all of it for Jesus. Living, serving, suffering, or dying, he could do it all. And he would do it all for Jesus. And he's not superhuman, he's just a human being like you and me. But what a place he's got to. You and me, living for Jesus in whatever your Monday to Sunday looks like, being willing to suffer without complaining, being willing to die as preferable. I'm not sure we're all there yet. I don't think I'm there yet, if I'm honest. Would I see the kind of suffering Paul's going through as not God's fault? Would I see it as not unfair after all I've done? Would I wonder about whether God had abandoned me? Would I see it as all for Jesus? Do I have or will I have this perspective on death? Maybe I will. God, I pray I will. I pray that when I'm faced with it, that I'll have this perspective. But it will help in the meantime if I'm obsessed with Jesus, if I'm living and suffering, if that comes along, for Jesus. If I'm obsessed with living for him, then it will make dying for him, I imagine, a lot easier. Then it would be better to go and be with God. The word depart that Paul uses in verse 23, I love this, because you know I love camping, right? He says, this word depart in verse 23, it's like you've been camping, but camping's over. So it's better to be away from camping and moving back, or not back, moving to that permanent place. Safe, dry place. Going away from the transitory, nomadic camping situation to stopping camping and departing all of that. I'm going to just preach this for a few more minutes. Possibly you've got in Paul's mind the old tent maker. Leaving the temporary, going to the permanent. C.S. Lewis speaks of this similar idea at the end of Narnia. At the end of, I think it's the end of the whole series of the Tales of Chronicles of Narnia. He says this, he writes this: the term is over. The holidays have begun. The dream is ended. This is the morning. And as he spoke, I think it's Aslan, he no longer looked to them like a lion. Of course it is Aslan. He no longer looked to them like a lion, but the things that began to happen after that were so great and beautiful that I cannot write them. And for us, this is the end of all the stories, and we can most truly say that they all lived happily ever after. But for them, it was only the beginning of the real story. All their life in this world and all their adventures in Narnia had only been the cover and the title page. Now at least they were beginning chapter 1 of the great story, which no one on earth has read, which goes on forever, in which every chapter is better than the one before. Finally, Paul says in verse 28, a church that is like this, standing firm, not afraid, because it's obsessed with Jesus and his story, not involved in infighting, but obsessed with the gospel, not obsessed with its own comfort and success, but obsessed with him and his story to the point of being willing to suffer and die. That kind of church, living it out like that, will be a sign for itself that they are on the right track, Paul says. It will be like a sign, like an omen, you get in different versions, that you're on the right track and that the rest of the world isn't. That's what he says. If the church is like this, if you stand firm like this, if you live lives worthy of the gospel, he says, then it will be like a sign, it'll be like a road sign. It says you're on the right track. And it will have the effect of people that don't know Jesus thinking, what is this? There's something about these guys. They're not killing each other anymore. They're obsessed with something that seems to be greater than him. And it will be a sign in that way.